Well, welcome everyone. We'll get started here in just a little bit. My name's Maria Reyna, Director of Orientation and Family Programs. We really appreciate you taking this afternoon to be with us on this really important topic today. So we'll just give it another few seconds to let those that are going to join us before I'll have my guest panelists and our colleagues here join us and introduce themselves here in a little bit. So just want to remind everyone we are recording. So this will be on our family page on the Orientation and Family Programs website. So that way we can have others that would want to watch this who weren't able to join us today to view it. And to also, that way you don't feel like you need to remember everything that we're going to talk about today, but you can also go back and view this on our website later. So again, my name is Maria, and I thank you for being with us this afternoon, and we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask Megan to define what consent means to get us started on this, and then I'll begin with the panelists. We have parents and we have colleagues on here along with students, and so when we go into the questions, I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves. But Megan, do you want to go ahead and get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for being here. My name is Megan. I'm the Assistant Director of Orientation and Family Programs. And a definition of consent, just to kick this off. So consent is an agreement or a permission expressed through affirmative, voluntary words or actions that are mutually understandable to all parties involved to engage in a specific sexual act at a specific time. And it's important to remember that consent can be withdrawn at any time as long as it is clearly communicated.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. Also, I want to say if you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. Megan, as the host, will be the only one to see those, so feel free to ask your questions and feel free to, no question really, I think this is one, again, that we're all going to learn together. So feel free to put in your questions and then Megan can ask the panelists, or depending on who the question is for, be able to relay that to us. So be sure to use that chat function if you'd like. So I'm going to start with our my colleagues here and our parent that's joining us. And we have colleagues that are parents of current students here as well. So I want us to start by asking you, and then feel free to unmute yourself as you wish to answer, and then introduce yourself. But why do you believe that this is an important conversation to have with your student? Crystal, Stacy, even Trisha, I don't know who would want to start off by answering that, but feel free.
I'm happy to start us off. And so I'm a parent. My student came here for 2 years, but I'm also an employee at Eastern. I've worked here at Eastern for 21 years. 13 of those years has been collectively in student conduct, student rights and responsibilities. And so we do a lot of hearings that have to deal with situations where consent is the question. And so in my experience here, that often, the question that is boiling down to whether a student violated someone else's rights around the idea of consent is that it's a communication. It boils down to whether consent has been given or hasn't been given. And often one party says that's what they understood, that they had consent, and the other party is saying, no, I never gave them consent. And so that's where I see this as a hugely important topic to have with our sons, our daughters, our family members, however they're connected, as to, when you go to college, what does it look like? What does it sound like? How is it given? So I think that's really hugely important.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacy. Crystal or Trisha, anything to add to that?
I'll go ahead. Hi, my name is Crystal Jones. I am an Eastern alumni. I actually went to school during the same time as Maria went to school. So it was nice to reconnect, and I'm glad to be able to be a part of this panel. I do have 2 children that are now Eagles as well. One came in during 2020, so that was a really, really tough year. And that's part of my reason why it's so important to have that discussion, because she came in to Eastern during COVID, when everything was, you're in your room, you're taking online classes, you don't get to socialize, you don't get to see things. So self-awareness was something that she had to be aware of. I raised my kids always to be aware of their surroundings, aware of who they're making friends with, who they're hanging out with, the things that their friends do. I tried to give my kids, while they were in high school, I wasn't one of those helicopter hovering parents. I tried to have my kids go out and experience things when they wanted to. But we do have Life 360 on our phones. Even when I was in North Carolina, halfway across the country, on the other side, when my daughter came to school here. So that was a big thing. But I also raised them from a very young age. Consent in my home is, even if you're going to touch your sister and push her and shove her, anytime they were playing and hitting each other, when they said no, no meant no. When they said stop, stop meant stop. And I would interject immediately if I heard a stop or a no. And that's kind of how we started that whole, when somebody says no, you need to stop, even with their siblings, not necessarily in a sexual context or in the context of this discussion where consent is sexual. Consent is consent, in my opinion. You always ask permission before you engage with somebody in any kind of shape or form, especially during COVID. Everybody was masked up, didn't want to touch each other. Hey, can I shake your hand, or can I give you a hug? I grew up in Hawaii, and so hugging was something that we do naturally. And all of that had to kind of cease and desist. And when I came to college from Hawaii here, hugging was a part of my culture that I had grew up with. And so coming up here, and people don't hug as often or as easily. And so you had to ask permission. Can I give you a hug? So that kind of started that in my family, is that you have to ask permission first. And it just reiterated that when my daughter came to college. And then thankfully my son got accepted too. And now the whole family is here. So I trust my kids to know when to say no and when to interject, even when they're with their friends and they see something not quite right. And if their friend's not comfortable saying something, my kids are the interjectors. They always step in and say, hey, it's time to go, or, can I ask you a question, and take them away. So that's kind of how I am with my family and my kids. And, it is a tough subject. So on the other side of it, if my kids ever come home wanting to talk about something or tell me, hey, this is what happened, I just listen. I'm not there to judge. I'm not there to tell them, oh, you did it the wrong way, or that's not how it should have been done. I always just listen, and then I add my feedback in a constructive type of ways.
Great. Thank you so much, Crystal. I really appreciate that. Anyone else?
I can go next. So my name's Laura Gant, and I'm a health education coordinator in our counseling and wellness office. And just from my lens as, kind of a public health educator, I believe it's important to have this conversation with your student, because it's often not happening elsewhere. When I interact with students, and maybe we talk about so I'm also coming with the lens more of a sexual health kind of consent. And I echo what Crystal said, consent's consent, and you should have permission to do anything, but really looking at it from kind of sexual consent. The schools aren't educating on it. And so it's a big gap often. And if we're relying on their peers or their friends or YouTube or movies or social media, or something to give them, ideas of what consent is, it's not always going to be accurate. And so I believe it's really important for parents to have those discussions about what is consent and what's not consent. Otherwise, students are just left to kind of fill in the gray area, and there can be a lot of gray area. And so, I believe that's why it's most important.
Thank you. Trisha, anything to add?
No, I'm here as a parent today.
Perfect. Great. So this might be a relevant question then, so I'll go to the next one. When you are in Crystal, and you all kind of touched a little bit on this already, but we're now talking about the conversations and how they can be difficult. But how are the conversations going? How do you begin those conversations? Did it go well? Did it not go so well? And maybe how did you, when they didn't go well, how did you then provide the information that you know that they needed as a parent? So I'll open that up.
I'll go first again. So similar to a lot of what Crystal said, with my boys, and because of being around this topic for a really long time, I started talking to my boys when they were little. In the realm of, yes, don't hate your brother, all those things, right? But also very intentionally about if someone tries to touch you without your consent. Especially when I went through Green Dot training and, kind of had an aha moment around just sending my son to the bathroom, right? I was thinking I was teaching independence when maybe I needed to be a little bit more cautious around it. It was kind of a hurt my heart moment when I had that realization. So my boys have been spoken to about consent more than they probably ever want to be. And my oldest is 27 years old and he still gets that conversation from time to time. But how I've been able to do it somewhat without a lot of resistance is I try to find things that they kind of find funny, that actually captures their attention. And one of a presentation I saw a long time ago used kind of the topic of consent around pizza and how we negotiate our toppings for our pizza. And one of my boys likes mushroom and olives, and my other boy doesn't. And so we here's an example. We're talking about and negotiating what we like on our pizza, and we come to agreement on that. Consent's not that much different. You need to talk about what your partner likes or doesn't like, and what's a no-go and what's a thumbs up. Without that conversation, you're not going to have consent. And so I try to make the conversation relational to something that maybe, depending on age and stage, that they're into. And I've had the most success around that. And like Crystal said, avoiding anything that comes across preachy has been my world.
Great, thank you for that. Any other examples or conversations that have gone well and maybe not so well?
Okay, looks like we're going in a pattern. For me, I have 2 boys and 2 girls, and they alternate. So my oldest is a boy, then I have a daughter, and then I have another boy, and then I have another daughter. And so for me, it was boys and girls are night and day. They receive messages very differently. So what worked for one child doesn't work for the next child. But what I related, most of the conversations that I related it to was, would you want your sister, would you want this to happen to your sister? Would you want this to happen to your brother? And kind of go that route with them, because my kids are protective of each other. That's kind of how we raise them. That's your big brother. He's going to be there to watch you and help you and protect you. And so for me, the conversation started that way. And again, at a very young age, we watch out for each other. We watch out for our siblings. We watch out for, we taught our boys to walk on the outside instead of the, inside. Don't put your sister or your girlfriend on the outside. You want to be there to protect them. So we have those conversations, and it kind of leads, the longer the conversation goes, it kind of leads into sexual consent and what is appropriate, inappropriate touches, and when you need to say something and when you need to voice what you have to say. And I always say, the sooner you voice if you're uncomfortable, the better off you are. Learning that, of course, you have to learn by experience, but you have to be able to voice what that uncomfortable feels for you to those that are important to you. And again, it's not an age appropriate conversation, like Stacy says. So my youngest is 10 and she thinks she's as old as the older two. Like, no, it's time for you to leave, not conversation that you need to hear. So being age appropriate and addressing the kids at the right age, at their level. My youngest did experience some aha moments that I was like, I'm not ready for this. She was in preschool, pre-K. And there was another child in there that she had become very close friends with. And just understanding at that age what, I like her. But her friend had self-identified as a wanting to be a boy. And so that kind of her daycare teachers called me about the situation, and that was I'm not ready for that yet. So I had to dial myself back and figure out how am I going to address my 4-year-old about gender and those topics. I'm like, I don't know how to do this with a 4-year-old. So that was very difficult, and we had to learn how to deal with that and that challenge and age appropriate conversations.
So I can go next. So kind of, my experience and lens that I'm coming from with is as an educator here at Eastern and talking to students. And so recognizing some of the students when they're engaging with me do have a really good idea of what consent is, and some students don't. And so those are kind of the examples that I can speak to. For the most part, I feel the experiences go well. Oftentimes when they don't go well, can be, when we have conversations about alcohol and consent, often the conversations, it's not so much that it goes poorly or it doesn't go well, right? But it's just not very black and white. And we get a lot of gray area. And then students are, well, what if this? And what if this? And we come up with lots of what if scenarios that just kind of get stuck in the, lost in the weeds. And so those have been my experiences overall well, and that students are receptive to consent. But again, just recognizing when I first started working here, I was surprised how many students didn't get these conversations through their parents, through an educator in high school. And so they're really left to come up with their own definition, whether it's right or wrong. So.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. We have 2 students that are joining us that we've asked to be on this panel. And I really thank Paige and Brandon for being here and really getting the voice of our students, because oftentimes it's students who are helping educate other students. It's our students who may or may not know these topics and have had experiences around having conversations with your own parents about these topics. So for the students, and whichever one unmutes first can go first. But the first question I have is, why do you believe understanding consent is vital to your success as a student and for all students? I know you're not voicing an opinion for all students, but why this topic is important for students to be successful here at Eastern?
So I'll go first. I think that understanding consent is really important for student success, because when you don't fully understand consent, things can happen and you may not realize that it isn't you consenting to that happening. And it can be really detrimental to their mental health, and it can affect how they want to, how they proceed throughout their school year. And it can cause trauma that they maybe don't address because they don't realize that it's trauma. I know for a lot of my friends, they didn't understand what consent was. They didn't talk about it with their parents. Their parents didn't think that was an important conversation, or they just didn't have that comfortability with their parents to talk about it. And then they came to college and things did happen to them, and it put them in a really bad headspace. And I have a friend who dropped out of college, and I have a friend who struggled so much that she didn't go to school for 3 weeks. Like, it can be really hard on a student's mental health when they don't understand what consent is.
Thank you for that, Paige. I really appreciate that. Brandon?
Uh, yeah, I totally agree with that. In terms of the mental health aspect, just because I feel that as students, we already go through a lot in terms of leaving, for most of us, having to leave our homes and having the security of having our parents or family figures there to help us or guide us. And when it comes to with the understanding consent aspect, is that you were raised a certain way into thinking that certain things are okay, but then when you leave and go to a new environment, you realize that it isn't. And for I know a lot of people that it almost makes them feel like not necessarily like defensive, but like almost like scared themselves because they start thinking like, oh, if this isn't correct, then have I been doing this like this whole time? And then it starts like the whole like adding back to the whole mental health aspect, it starts adding worry to students a lot, especially when they start thinking like, did I give consent here, did I give consent there? And it starts affecting them. And sometimes students or just people in general don't feel comfortable speaking about it, and it affects them in a way that they don't even see it until others know. As a CA, I've had a lot of training in learning how to view different signs when students or people in general are going through things, and I have been applying that in certain situations and in hearing instances that happens between students and like whether it's on campus or off campus. It's just like it's almost like they fear like um trying to bring it up in a way, just because like adding to what Paige said earlier and how they necessarily talked or like necessarily had those conversations at a younger age to where like them just learning it now brings in that aspect of uncomfortability or like making them feel uncomfortable speaking about it because it's like there it's like an issue that no one really expects to have to like go through something as traumatic as like a consent issue until it happens. And then once it happens, it gets pretty like difficult because like besides having to go through the suffering of the moment, it also has to go through the long-term effect. And like I've known people that like they like they'll brush it off and they'll try to like move on and act like nothing happens, but like they're like when others observe them, you could totally tell that something's off and they just don't feel comfortable speaking about it. But then I've also met other people who are like it almost like traumatizes them to the point to where they lack the ability to function how they used to. And yeah, it's like, but being able to understand consent is important because I feel like the more students understand that, like the less incidents and issues occur. And if they're able to properly like understand and respect what it is, because there's one thing just asking someone to know what consent is, and there's another one to tell them to and actively know that they will respect it. And but like once you reach that point of them being able to acknowledge and accept what it is, it just feels like a better aspect of safety and security for everyone else. Because I feel like or I mean I don't know for me, but the way that I have always viewed it is as like since I'm the oldest sibling of my family, I've always viewed it like, oh, what I want my little brother or my little sister to go through something like this. And I try to apply that to like my community and like the residents on my floor. I don't want any of them to ever go through any issues like this just because it's a very difficult thing to handle and difficult thing to talk about. But it's also good for them to understand what consent is. That's why we have consent boards up to try to inform them in any way we can. Because like we mentioned earlier, like the conversation with parents isn't very common as it should be.
Thank you, Brandon, for that. And that is a great segue into the next question is, how did your parents talk to you about consent? Or did they not? Because I think this is where we are mindful that some students do come in with having had those conversations. And then sometimes it's helpful to hear, if you did, what went well, what didn't go well. But then if it didn't, what did that mean for you when you started college?
Yeah, so my parents talked to me about consent for a long time. Like it's been multiple conversations about it, and I couldn't tell you when I first learned about it because it goes that far back. I grew up in a very open household where that was like stuff about consent was talked about. Being one of two girls. And I think a lot of them, I couldn't remember how they went or how they were talked about. It still sometimes gets brought up, but one thing I would do if I were talking to a child about consent was make sure that they understand the full context of it. Is that like if you can consent from the very beginning, and you can also change your mind later. But if you say no and you are coerced into consenting, that's not consent at all. And that was a big thing for me, was that a lot of people don't understand that. They're like, oh, no means no and yes means yes. But eventually I said yes, or eventually they said yes. But if no was explicitly said first, you cannot coerce someone into saying yes.
Thank you. Really good point. Brandon, any conversations with your parents on consent?
Not so, like, since I grew up in a Hispanic household, my parents were really reserved. They're not necessarily, these type of topics aren't stuff you don't talk with necessarily with your children. It's more like I, from what I've noticed in my family and then my cousins, other people that I know, these conversations are held more with, like, I guess, like, teachers and stuff like that. Like, your parents almost feel like, I don't want to say they feel uncomfortable, or I know my parents, they would bring up some instances like where like the whole consent thing is like you do not do what you don't want to do, and no one should force you to do it. But it works. It's a two-way street. If someone doesn't want to do something, they shouldn't have to do it, especially if it's like in terms of like with regards to consent or like sexual or like physical, because a lot of something that I didn't know necessarily about consent is until I started getting training, is how often people saying no isn't accepted. And that's where something that I wish was like I had been taught before, because from when I used to think was like, oh, when people say no, that's the end of the line, like it's over. But like after, especially like having to applying like what I've learned and witnessed as a CA, is like a lot of instances no doesn't like mean no to a lot of people, which like frightens me, just because if it's becoming to a point to where like, yeah, people saying no isn't enough for the other person involved, it's starting to like worry me in terms of like, oh, like, is this something that's bigger? Is this something that people like? Because I understand a lot of parents do not feel comfortable speaking with this about their children, especially because they always be like, oh, like I raised my child good, like I took like they're a good person, they wouldn't do something like that, and then when it happens, you're like, well, like there's nothing you could do then because it actually happened, and then it's like it's something that I know parents will feel bad because it almost like feels as if it's reflecting upon them in a way, just because they feel like a lot of parents eventually feel bad because they're like, dang, did I not raise my child correctly? Was I not a good parent for doing this? Like, and then like it's hard, because students, when they go through it, they feel like, am I a bad person for doing this, like and stuff like that. But parents are the same way, like they feel similarly. And like I mentioned, that there's something like I wish like my parents would have spoken to me more, is just like how much, like, because when I found out the numbers, and like 1 in 5 women and 1 in 10 men are like tend to be like sexually harassed in terms of society, that number really popped out to me because I didn't realize just how often it was, just because my parents never really felt necessary to talk about that. But like I feel like if more people understood just how often it happens, how much of an issue it has become, then I feel like they would actively try to fix it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. Makes me think, you know, kind of I'm jumping ahead in the student questions if you're following along with me, but, you know, what programming would you like to see on campus to educate your peers on consent? Because I think what you're touching on is we find that it is difficult conversations. So we recognize that families aren't necessarily having these conversations. And so what you, as students, would like to see, or are there things happening now around consent? And what could we do more around consent as a community at Eastern that you think that would help to educate our students?
So I think that like offering as a basis, like maybe making a brief post on consent on some sort of social media form, but within that post having a link to a website that has more information on consent, that gives you like the wider definition and all that. But I also think that even like a Q&A type thing online, so that students don't have to do it face to face, because it is a conversation that some of them are uncomfortable having, and maybe even anonymous, but where they can ask these questions and these questions are answered by someone who's on the other side of the screen, just to help them feel more comfortable asking these questions, and like opening it up so that they don't have to come to something like this and feel very alone or stand out.
No, that makes sense. Thank you. Appreciate that. Anything to add, Brandon?
So the way that the school's been doing it so far, I feel like it's been showing that they're trying. Like I know in orientation, they have the whole consent seminar where they have the simulation and think the student go. And that was a mandatory thing for all students to attend. And something that we do in here in housing is we had our information boards. And I remember our last month, it was all about consent and how we were trying to figure different ways to speak with our residents about it and putting them up just so that they understood that this is a major thing that they have to be aware of. I feel like if there's something in the future I feel Eastern should really consider doing is making like how Paige mentioned that whole survey thing, and maybe I don't know, maybe adding a mandatory aspect to it, because it's one, because in terms of that the seminar we had during orientation, it was to my understanding that students were required to go, and I tried everything I could to get all my students to attend to that. But I knew a lot of other people in housing struggled to do that just because a lot of their students just didn't care. And I mean, like when something's mandatory and you aren't like recorded or like registered that you attended it, I feel like it is not much of a push for it. I feel like if maybe the school tried an agenda to where they had the students register up to show that they were there or to prove that they were there, and if not, maybe a potential fine or something. So there's actually like a push for them to do, like to learn this, to show that they learn it, they know about it, just to show that the students are, because it's one, like I mentioned earlier, like it's one thing telling them they have to do it, it's another thing, like I don't want to say like um forcing them to do it, but like I want to say like showing to them that this is something serious, that they need to do it, is something that I feel like the school should like try to push for more, to let it be more efficient and effective than it has been so far.
100% agree with you, Brandon. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is something that we continue to look at, is how do we get these messages to all of our students in a way that we know is beneficial to them, but helping them to see that we want this topic to be something that they see that is going to be beneficial to them as well. So definitely working with that. And my colleagues that are on the call today know that that's something that we continue to work on and to see how we can get all of our students to hear these messages and really understand the seriousness around it. So thank you. Those are our formal questions unless I missed something. So feel free if I missed something and you want to add. We do have the chat open, so any family members that want to put your questions in the chat, we definitely would love to hear from you. So feel free to do that. But I do want to open it up as well for any last comments or any last tidbits you want to share. I know for me, I have a 16-year-old, and I just asked him the other day, what is your definition of consent? I was trying to get a feel for where he's at. Am I doing my job well? And bringing up these conversations as hard as they are, and using language. I think, Laura, one of our meetings that we had, you need to use the correct language and not shy away from the language. And I think because it gets so, you know, the lines are drawn, you know, we sometimes want to go so far and then we pick a different term, so we don't really say what we need to say. I know I'm learning. I learn from my colleagues when we have these conversations. I learn from my families, and I learn from my own upbringing. Brandon, you brought a great, you know, being Hispanic, being Mexican families, we didn't talk about this. And I learned from it. Thankfully, I was number 8 of 10. So my older siblings told me about things that I just didn't learn from my parents. And so I think it's really important because we understand family values are very key in this and what we value as our home. But we also know that when you're, you know, having your student go to college, and we are here with them here at Eastern, we recognize that we are having these conversations. We want to have these conversations with the students, but we also know the importance of the family unit being a part of this. So we're here to help, whatever that might look like in terms of helping you have these conversations. Know that that's also our role here, because we're all learning together. So panelists, I cannot thank you enough for being on here, but I do want to leave it open because we still have time if you want to share any last thoughts on this topic and any other tidbits you would like to share.
I did have a question. So kind of going off of what Maria and Brandon were talking about. So how can parents who maybe haven't really had a conversation about sex with their kid, but they do want to educate them now on consent? And we kind of talked about this, but like, how can that bridge be gapped in a natural way that's not like, oh, we've never talked about this before, and all of a sudden we're like in the deep end? Any tips or suggestions on that at all?
I'll start. I think as uncomfortable as it is, we don't necessarily see or want to see our children as sexual beings. That was a transition moment for me personally. And so I really think you just have to start. I mean, I don't think there's any one right way to do it. Just try to pay attention to your kid, try to, you know, connect where they are. In a way that they understand, and just do your best to have the conversation. And it might not go smoothly at first. It's going to feel awkward as heck, but you just got to start, because it will possibly save them a lot of heartache in their future by just doing it and trying the best you can to have that conversation.
I'm gonna jump in really quick, and I totally agree with what Stacy said. You know, having those conversations and when to start is there's never a right time, there's never a right way. They don't make a parenting handbook, they don't make a, you know, conversation starter handbook for these things. But my introduction to it was with my oldest son. He's not my biological son, so he was on a visit with his biological mom, away from my home, and she called me and said, "Hey, I don't know what to do with this situation." I'm like, "What situation are you talking about?" That situation was he got caught watching pornography on their family family computer. And that was an awkward moment for me. I have another, she's his mom. He's in her house right now. I don't know what advice to give. But that was the awkward moment for me, that we had to have a conversation. He was still a teen. And how do you have that conversation with your son? As a mom, that's not a conversation, that's dad's responsibility. Well, being a military family, dad wasn't always around to have those conversations with the kids. So I had to have that conversation, and I had to figure out a way to do it. And like I said before, I have a son, a daughter, and a son and a daughter. And so what worked for the oldest, I had to address the pornography issue, of course, and that led into that conversation. And I dialed it back. Instead of being upset at him for doing what he did, I said, why did you do it? Are you curious? What are you curious about? Let's have that conversation. And then we got into, okay, if you're curious about that, how do you approach, your friends? What is appropriate touches, inappropriate touches, and kind of led that way. However, that didn't work for my daughter because, she never experienced that. She was a very athletic, very independent woman. And the encounter with her was that her friend had confided in her that something inappropriate happened. And she got upset about it because she's the aggressive one. She's the one that has very strong-minded and doesn't tolerate a lot of things and has a very low patience for, she calls it, silliness. But she's a one strike kind of person. Like if you upset her once, then you're done. She cuts you off quick. So she didn't know how to, one, console her friend, and two, deal with that situation. And that was another conversation that I had to have. So every kid is a different conversation. And I kind of let my kids lead to that. However, I'm the type of parent that I don't want my kids to be afraid to come and talk to me about anything. So I'm an open book with my kids. Age appropriate conversations, of course. But I start off young. I start off telling them stories. I tell them my experiences when they're ready to hear my experiences. When I first grew up, or when I was coming up and coming to college, my experiences then. I share those stories immediately as soon as I think, okay, you're at a right age to hear this. We're going to have this conversation. And we started that young. So whatever works for most families. And I know a lot of families, a lot of different cultures. I didn't have the conversations with my parents. My parents, the conversations I had with my parents were, you're not having an abortion. That's not what we do. I'm like, okay, but why does it have to go my question to my parents was, what's before abortion? What are the steps before we even get there? Those are things that we learned in school, sex ed and all that kind of stuff, but never conversations about consent. So one, I appreciate having this panel and this discussion because it's necessary. We know that our world, our culture, and our colleges don't have that, the diverse populations that we have, especially here at Eastern. Not everybody gets taught the same things. And when you get into college, that's not the time to learn, because a lot of times that you're going to learn are in a bad way, so you don't want that negative experience to turn into mental health issues. And like I said, my daughter came when it was COVID, and it was already a struggle with mental health. And it was a fearful time for a parent to send a student away to college. So having discussions ahead of time and being prepared to that, no matter how uncomfortable it was very necessary, still is very necessary to have. So having panels like this that the university is providing for students and parents that don't have that experience or ability to have had that experience in conversations, I think is a great thing. So kudos to Maria and her team.
Thank you. Anyone else? I know, I think we have a student who has to get to class by 1. So we want to be mindful of time, but anything else? Any last minute advice or I will add that this will be, as it's being recorded, will be on our website. There's a great blog that we provided. And I think, you know, Laura, I know these are the beginnings of the conversations. I know, you know, Trisha and Stacy, we continue to have these conversations as colleagues on this campus, but we are trying, and not that we totally have gotten it right, because we haven't. And we're going to continue to have these conversations. So please visit our website. Please go to the blog, and thank you, Laura, for doing that, and team. And I think it's not going to be just this one conversation and then we're done, because we recognize it's ongoing. We recognize that this is something that, you know, we're beginning. I appreciate that we're recording this, because this is something we'll share as we get new students and families that are going to continue to be a part of Eastern throughout the coming year. And so definitely reach out if you feel like, you know, later on you're thinking about this and you have a question, or you know, just weren't totally confident about asking questions right now, but know that we're here and willing to be there when you do have those questions, especially with the students as well. So anything last minute? I was gonna throw our next sessions, or Megan, we were gonna talk about we do have these blogs throughout the year, and then we do have the Eagle Family Hour topics. So please stay tuned for the next one. And I know we will be resharing our mental health one that we did last year. As winter comes, we recognize that students may struggle with a lack of sunlight. I know sometimes I do, and I miss that sun, but definitely know that we will continue to share some more information and continue to have these blogs and our Eagle Family Hour. So we appreciate you being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you, panelists. We really appreciate you. Again, I can't thank you enough for doing this and being a part of this very important topic and conversation. And as we continue to learn, we'll continue to share. All right, well, everyone have a good rest of your day.